for the past 5 years, having lost my best friend back in 2017, and then my dad in 2018, and my mom last September. So to be honest with you, when Peter meant, we were vacillating over what topics to cover. And when Peter mentioned this topic of grief, I thought, are you sure you want to go there, Peter? Because, to be honest, grief is one of those topics that people tend to not be excited to talk about. And for most of us, we think about grief and we instantly connect that to feelings of sadness, this sort of doom and gloom type of grayness that, frankly, a lot of people tend to shy away from, right? So, but for me, the fact still remains that whether we like it or not, the universal law of impermanence dictates that everything we love, we lose, right? And so grief and loss are really a central part of our human experience, one that we will all encounter, an inevitable form of suffering that, as Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh once said, when we learn how to suffer, we suffer much, much less, right? And so when you really think about it, grief work is a core element in our ability to sustain and also maintain our well-being and also the well-being of our communities, which is why I agreed to indulge in this topic today with that goal in mind. And so if you're willing to share, you can message me directly or share to everyone in the chat, but I would just love to get a sense of really what brought you here today. And if you're willing to share, maybe what is your experience with grief? Whether you've lost a loved one, a family member, maybe anticipating the loss of a loved one, or maybe some other form of loss, perhaps loss of a friendship, a dream unfulfilled, a way of life that you miss, a sense of freedom that you feel might be taken away, whatever it is for you. I'd just love to get a sense of your experience with grief. Loss of a partner, yeah. I heard of 7 deaths this week, friends, neighbors, family members, of my colleagues and some of my dearest friends. So I know that this is a topic that many of us are, and a reality that many of us are holding. So thank you for those of you who have chosen to share. And so with that in mind, grief for me is always short-lived. I don't allow myself to give in to such low vibration. I love that perspective, Brigada. And mine is really the opportunity to find the gifts of grief, to find the joy in grief. And the gifts of grief for many people is a bit of an oxymoron, isn't it? Like, how is that possible? But that is the lens through which I have chosen to look at and experience grief, loss of my mother-in-law. So I stand with each of you in your loss and in your grief. Also in the anticipatory grief, if you have a loved one who might have a terminal illness, or in this person's case, a disease that might impact the way that you know them and have come to love them and have come to experience them. And so you're grieving the loss of the way of being with them that is no longer, right? So the beautiful thing about the few of us who have come together today is that grief for me is really a heart journey, one that I feel is best traveled in community, to be with people who get it, who are willing to have the conversation, right? And willing to be in the experience with you. And one of my favorite books on this topic, The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Frank Keller, he writes that it was through the dark waters of grief that I came to touch my unlived life, because there is a strange intimacy between aliveness and grief. It's a sacred exchange between what seems unbearable and also what is most exquisitely alive. And so my hope, as I welcome you into this space, as I welcome you to the conversation and to this moment, my hope is that each of you will leave here today with a greater sense of aliveness, with a heart that is more open and possibly even more tenderized, and probably a different perspective and experience of grief. So what I'm thinking of doing is I'll share a little bit about my story and also what I call the surprising truths of grief. I'll share a perspective on what mindful grieving is, and I'll talk a little bit about the gifts of grief, and hopefully you will leave with some thoughts or rituals of change, ways of seeking refuge, as I like to say, that I've really found helpful and that we also practice on retreat when we are working through grief. So I'll start with my personal story because I think it really illuminates sort of how I've come to experience this concept of mindful grieving, and really how I'm learning still on the journey of what it means to grieve with grace. When I got the news of my mom's cancer diagnosis, I literally collapsed. I remember feeling very weak physically, but also emotionally. And I found myself asking, how will I possibly find the strength to pull through this? I had just lost my dad 6 months before we heard of her diagnosis. And I couldn't fathom that I could muster up the strength to go through this process with her. And I remember sitting in the doctor's office and hearing the words, stage 4 lung cancer that has metastasized to her brain, her spine, her adrenal. I mean, it was everywhere, right? And so as I've come to learn to practice, I took a deep breath, preparing myself for what I knew would be the most difficult days of my life ahead. And so for anyone here who has lost a parent or is in the process of losing a parent, you know very well that the loss of a parent is unlike any other. And what was really interesting for me was the contrasting experience of losing my dad quite suddenly, no chance for a goodbye, no preparation, no thoughtful final words. And then this really different experience of what I've come to learn is anticipatory grief. The anticipation, knowing that in a matter of days, weeks, months at best, we were lucky to have her for 2 whole years, that my mom would someday take her last breath. And so what was really interesting for me about this experience was being able to be in what we call the seat of the observer, which is a mindfulness practice of really cultivating and watching ourselves with this conscious, mindful awareness. And so I was able to see myself, like observe myself, navigating the final months of my mom's life. This gave me a chance to really witness me putting my own words to practice, right? Practicing what I preach, and really putting the gifts of mindfulness to work. I got a chance to really reflect on, and I often found myself asking, how can the practice support me in this moment? And of course, it became this really interesting ping pong back and forth, right? Of meeting myself, having those moments where I could meet myself with true loving self-compassion, until my human nature of self-criticism would kick in, and then I would start beating up myself for not doing this right. You're not getting this right, okay? You're a mindfulness teacher, you're screwing this up. So I would have these ping pong moments. I mean, I still have those experiences, if I'm being honest. But all in all, what I'd love to share with you are what I've come to see as the surprising truths that I've learned so far, and would just love to hear if you would continue sharing in the chat just your reactions to these and what might your experience with some of these be as well, and open to answering any questions that might come up. So surprising truth number one, as I've shared, is that grief is not only experienced when you lose someone you love, right? We can experience grief from any form of loss, loss of a job, a relationship, a way of life that you miss, a disability that now limits your way of being, and the way that you experience life. Even the loss of autonomy from the pandemic is a form of grief that many people have been having to grapple with. Moving away and missing your neighborhood, your neighbors, the person at the checkout at your grocery store, right? There are so many different versions of loss that we can encounter. And we only think of grief, we typically only think of grief in the context of losing a loved one and losing their life. The second surprising truth is that grief isn't a problem to be solved. It's not something to get over. It's a lifelong experience that we learn how to carry. Grief doesn't just get better with time. You know, people will tell you, oh, it will get better in time. What I'm also learning is that grief also gets better with work. And that if left unprocessed, grief has a way of seeping into areas of our lives in very destructive and unproductive ways. Some really common symptoms of unprocessed grief, you might recognize these in yourself, you might recognize these in others. We see increased agitation and sort of this intolerance that can create conflict in our relationships. We can also see disengagement with work or a loss of interest in things that you used to typically enjoy. We find ourselves pushing really hard. I found myself pushing really hard with work, using busyness as a distraction, not wanting to talk about the loss or share the story of grief. One, for fear that we're going to bring sadness into the room or bring sadness, you know, I don't want to be a downer, or fear of revisiting the experience. We'd just rather keep it in the nice box that we might have put it in for now. We might also find ourselves blaming others for things going wrong in our life because we don't want to take responsibility for the experience that we're having. There's also this very isolating way that we can feel that we're different from everyone else. This feeling that nobody really understands what we're going through because they haven't lost a mom. And it can often create divisiveness, even in our relationships, if we have a spouse who, for example, doesn't know what this feels like because they haven't lost a parent or a sibling, for example. And it was also interesting for me to learn that grief can also show up as phantom pains and aches in the body. That one was really surprising for me, which brings me to the surprising truth number 4, which is that grief is a full body experience. And so there's a reason that we get so tired, why we sometimes find it challenging to focus, why we have short-term memory loss, or just don't feel that we have the stamina that we're used to. And so it's really important to explore, how is the grief living in my body, right? Or issues live in our tissues. And very important for us to pay attention and really honor how the grief wants to express itself. And if we listen very closely, we can oftentimes really hear the voice of our grief. Our emotions in general will talk to us, right? It might sound crazy, but there's a way of unlocking the intelligence of our bodies by tuning in to the voice of the emotion. It's why we call it emotional intelligence, right? So I personally subscribe to the idea that emotions are energy in motion. And so as a complex emotion, my grief, I learned, really wanted to express itself through movement. So you might actually find this very funny, but it was not uncommon to find me on Sunrise Beach in Florida, AirPods in my ears with Ryopi, who is an incredible classical pianist. And I would be dancing on the shoreline as if I were formally trained by Juilliard to be a ballerina, which, for the record, I've never taken a dance class in my life. but it was a way that I could allow myself to allow the grief to express itself in the creative way that it wanted to. And yes, my mom would say, were people there? Were people watching you? And I would say, yes, I was entertainment for their morning on the beach. So that's my number 4, that grief is a full body experience, and it's important to find ways of expressing and touching into how it's living in the body. Number 5 is the painful amplifier of shame that so many people carry with this myth, this belief that grief should have an expiration date. You know, people will ask, so how many years ago was this? Wow, and you're still really struggling with that, huh? Grief isn't something that we have to be ashamed of or apologize for, and it lives on for as long as we live, right? It's really a heart journey that requires hard work. And because it can be so isolating, it's very important to be in community and surround ourselves with other people who are going through it too, to share the story of grief with people who care to listen. Number 6 for me is that, to the earlier point, that joy, that grace, that ease is possible despite the grief. And that we don't have to feel guilty for allowing ourselves to have that joy, to give ourselves that grace, and to find that peace. Number 7 for me is that grief comes in waves. Some are like a slight wave of sadness. We have a memory, we have this chuckle, and then we have this like intense sense of loss and emptiness that memory can never be relived because they're no longer here. And so it washes over us, and we move on. And then there's those crashing waves that we literally feel is here to drown us. And so part of this journey for me has been to create a surfboard that allows us to surf through the waves of grief, and to do that with grace. So mindful grieving has become my surfboard, which I'll define really quickly, and then I'd love to move us into a practice. So mindful grieving for me is a more conscious, and for many people, a more liberating approach to grieving. And what it does is it applies the powers and the principles of mindfulness, loving compassion, to the grieving process, right? It's bringing the mindful awareness coupled with heartful compassion to the truth and depths of our grief. It's learning to trust in the vastness of our hearts, to be able to really lean in and almost to pierce into the eyes of our grief with this knowing, with this assurance, with this trust that we can surrender to, and therefore learn from and journey with our grief. By becoming students of grief, we allow ourselves to establish layers and layers and layers of trust, both with ourselves, but with others, with our families, with our communities, and really with life. It's been incredible for me to witness, going back to that day when I was questioning, like, how will I possibly find the strength to go through this? When I was able to witness my own strength in ways that I never thought was possible. And so if we allow ourselves, we get to witness our own capacity to love and support ourselves. I remember during one of our Grieving with Grace retreats, we did an exercise of self-compassion, which I'll have you do shortly, inviting folks to practice different forms of self-compassion. And one of the participants shared just how surprising it was, but quite powerful and liberating for her to give herself these acts of self-compassion, that she had never experienced what it feels like to give herself a hug. Something that she so profoundly found supportive, and something that she realized is always available to her. And so even just tapping into the power of the breath, which is an incredible instrument that allows us to build our capacity for greater endurance and resilience. So I want us to give that a try. We have just a few more moments left. We've been having this conversation about grief. I've shared my story and my journey with my mom and losing my dad. And so I'm sure there's a lot that might be coming up for you. And I'd like to invite you into a practice that we can bring that mindful awareness and that loving compassion to whatever it is that you might be experiencing right now. So just taking a moment to make any adjustments that might be helpful, allowing yourself to get into a comfortable position, closing your eyes if that feels comfortable. When you close your eyes, no one else can see you. Or maybe holding a soft gaze on the floor in front of you or on the wall before you. And plugging into the calming powers of the breath. Let's take a few moments to deepen the breath. Breathing deeply and very deliberately on the inhale. And then very slowly, very gently, breathing out. Opening the mouth if that feels comfortable for you, and really allowing yourself to just exhale. I'd like to invite you to locate a part of your body where you can really experience the breath in a very vivid way. And so I'll give you a few choices here. You might notice the sound of the breath, this ocean-like sound, noticing the breath or perhaps for you, it's the sensation of the breath. The tingling sensation at the nostrils, the tingling sensation in the back of your throat. And just noticing what it's like to tune in to the sensation of the breath. Perhaps for you, it's the movement of the breath. The upward movement of the chest. Or maybe the in and out movement of the belly. So choosing your own adventure here, whether tuning in to the sound of the breath, the sensation of the breath, or the movement of your breath. Take a few moments to establish that location as your home base. And by doing that, getting really familiar with all the elements of the breath that you can. Really investigating your experience of the breath with a sense of curiosity and seeing what can you notice about your breath. Tuning in to all the tiny details. Becoming very familiar with breath. And by doing that, making the breath your home. finding comfort, finding safety, finding refuge. And from this place of groundedness, I'll invite you to experiment with different ways of holding and supporting yourself through acts of self-compassion. And you might choose to experiment with these different options. So the first being just holding your hand as if you were holding the hand of a child. Keeping your eyes closed as you do that. And imagine rubbing the back of the hand and just noticing as you place your thumb rubbing the back of your hand, what that feels like. Just this gentle caress of love. You might experiment with placing a hand on the chest, maybe even two hands on the chest. This sense of holding your heart, giving your heart a high five. And just noticing what that feels like. Or perhaps giving yourself a hug, placing your palms on your shoulders or on your elbows. Just noticing what it feels like to give yourself a hug. Holding yourself in warmth and love and support. Just noticing what that feels like. Relaxing now, allowing your hands to fall back into your lap. Taking a single deep breath. Breathing out through the mouth. Just noticing what this moment feels like for you. When you're ready, opening your eyes very softly, very gently. I'd love to possibly hear in the chat what you experienced. What we've practiced today, seeking refuge, finding safety in the home base of the breath, is a place that we can visit when we experience those waves of grief and it feels so intense. We question if we will ever be able to get through this. And demonstrating, witnessing, experiencing our ability to love ourselves in those moments when the grief can feel so isolating, or we feel that it would be an imposition to share what we are experiencing with a loved one. And so where do we go to get the love and support that we so need and deserve in that moment? We can give ourselves a hug. If we're not in a place that we feel comfortable doing that, then without anyone knowing, we can hold our own hand through the moment and walk ourselves through the wave of grief that we might be experiencing. So I'll end with a final thought, and from, again, the book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. Bringing grief and death out of the shadows is our spiritual responsibility. It is our sacred duty. And by doing this work, we may be able to feel our deepest desires for life come alive again. We get to remember who we are, where we belong, and the depth of love that we hold. The greater the love, the greater the loss. So with that, thank you all so much for showing up for yourselves today in this beautiful way, and for being in community as we journey through our grief. Thank you so much.